Hello, everybody. This is our last lecture in linguistic anthropology, and I purposely picked this article, but this article is Male to Female Miscommunication. As you can tell, this is a very old book, very old article, but let's get into it. I'll explain towards the end why I picked this. Real quickly, again, reflection 4 and the quiz is due on Friday. Really, we only have one more week of new instruction after this, and shoot, we're like basically done. All right. Right now, I'm planning to have the final available from August 3rd, I believe is for August 3rd, Thursday, until August 7th, I believe is Monday. And then the extra credit will be due on the 8th. Don't worry, I'll post it so you'll see it. But that's the general plan right now. Okay. So you'll have 4 days to complete the final. All right. Again, if you have any questions, just shoot me an email. I'd be more than happy to answer. Okay. All right, so let's think about this. What are some of the differences communication between? What are some of the differences in communication methods and language between opposite sexes? How are they the same or different among females or males? Right. So now let's first of all let's break down this word, right? Because again, as we learned in our last section, right? This book or this title should probably be more accurately be women and men, right? But let's talk about this. So let's think about a scenario. What are some of the different ways in which the opposite gender of you communicates, right? There's a million different situations, right? But the one I always like to talk about in class is, let's say you come to my class first day and you try to make a friend with somebody, right? First of all, what, how do you approach a person that is of the same gender as you, right? And number two is how do you approach someone that is of the opposite gender of you? How are they different, right? And that's a pretty good gauge to help show you that basically men and women communicate very differently. Okay. Um, in my classes in the past, the biggest thing for the girls or women in my class, they say they always start with a compliment, right? So it's like, oh, I love your bag. Where'd you get your bag? And then it goes on from there, right? And then the guys have kind of been it's a little bit not as vocal about it, but they talk about finding something in common to talk about, right? So it's like maybe it's the sports or maybe it's maybe it's even class, right? But the main point is that they're talking about something in common as opposed to the compliment starting the conversation. Okay, so that's very interesting. Now I also want you to think about if you're trying to engage in a friendship with someone, how is that different than if you're to engage in a friendship with someone of the opposite gender? How's that the different if you were to engage with someone with romantic interests, right? So there obviously are different ways of communicating, but I want you to really try to think about, okay, what are some of the ways that women and men communicate differently? Okay. Hold on, yeah, here we go. All right, good. Okay. So the article is pretty straightforward in the question it's asking, right? The question it's asking is basically, we as men and women learn English, right? And a lot of times we are in the same country, United States, we're in the same state, we're in the same city, we're in the same neighborhood, we're in the same district, we're in the same schools, we're in the same family sometimes. Why do men and women or girls and boys still miscommunicate? Right? Because we're all under the same cultural roof. Why is miscommunication so apparent between men and women and boys and girls? Okay. So first, before we get into it, let's talk about some features of women's and men's communication. Okay. The first thing from women's features: women have a greater tendency to ask questions. They tend to do more of the quote unquote shit work in maintaining social interaction. Women tend to use more positive minimal responses. Women tend to use silent protest after they have been interrupted or received a delayed or minimal response. And women tend to explicitly acknowledge other speakers by using words like you and we. Okay, so very interesting. Okay, so the first one, the second one, actually one, two, three, and five, right? So basically all of them except for the silent protest one. Those four are very related, right? Greater tendency to ask questions and doing more of the shit work sorry. Let me explain doing more of the shit work first. Doing more of the shit work means basically they put more effort and work into maintaining a smooth conversation. So, for example, if we were having a conversation and if it was a guy, right? So if I was like, yo, like how's your day going? A guy would be like, it was good, end, period, right? A girl would have more of a tendency to be like, oh, it was good. I did this and did that. How was your day? Right. And the point there is that they are trying to maintain the conversation so it's smooth, right? So it doesn't end abruptly. While men tend to end the conversation abruptly with no problems. Okay, anyways. So that's what doing more of the shit work and maintaining social interaction is talking about. Now, the first two, the first three and the fourth one are related, right? So more tendency to ask questions. That questions a lot of times are to maintain the conversation, right? Um, when they use positive minimal responses. Positive minimal responses are things like yes, nodding your head. That's positive minimal response. That is also maintaining, again, a smooth conversation, right? And finally, the same thing as using words like you and we is to basically include those people, actively include those people in the conversation. That is, again, another attribute of women trying to create a smooth conversation, a smooth social interaction. Okay, so these are very interesting traits. I find personally, and in many of my classes, this is a pretty valid list of features for women's communication, right? And finally, women tend to use silent protest after they've been interrupted or received a delayed minimal response. So basically, when if a nod or or a yes or whatever was to indicate to women that you're listening, when you show basically that you're not listening, they're like, all right, F it, I'm not gonna say anything. Okay. Now I have seen this sometimes. I had to say it's not as often as the rest of them, but definitely the other four I've seen all the time, right? I feel like this is a very relevant list of features. Okay. Now, moving on, men's features. Men are more likely to interrupt the speech of their partner. They're more likely to challenge or dispute. They're more likely to ignore the comments of other speakers. They control or steer the topic of conversation by adding introducing topics. And men make more direct declarations of fact or opinion. So these are all, again, very related, right? I think they're all kind of related to the last two, right? So if you're thinking about steering the conversation or adding topics or making which your opinion heard, that means that you're more likely going to ignore the comments of other speakers. And you're also more likely so concerned about what you're going to say that you're not thinking about what other people are saying, right? And that goes into the same reasoning for the first one, where you're going to interrupt the speech of whoever else you're talking to. Okay. These are super relevant. I feel like men are taught to do this all the time. I think that, but I'm sure everyone here has known someone that likes to argue for arguing's sake. This is a pretty relevant list of features. Okay, so this is women's features and men's features. Okay, now, so why do men and women have these features? Why do men and women communicate this way? In the past, okay, not this. So if you get this wrong in the test, I know you didn't listen to this lecture. In the past, not now, in the past, people, other authors, other researchers have basically said that men and women communicate this way because it reflects the power dynamic that exists in our society, right? So basically, men dominate our mainstream society, and so they also dominate in conversation, right? And on top of that, what is normal, what is appropriate for to communicate like a woman or to communicate like a man, literally takes away power from the woman, right? Those like this last point. So essentially, like being ladylike in terms of your communication takes away power from the conversation, right? So basically, previous researchers have thought that, well, because men are dominant in this way in society, the way they speak reflects, their power in society, right? This author, however, while that may be true, the explanations doesn't explain why. And this author goes into why they miscommunicate, right? Cultural differences between men and women in their conception of friendly conversation, their rules for engaging, and probably most important, their rules for interpreting it. American men and women come from different social linguistic subcultures, having learned to do things with words in a conversation so that when they attempt to carry conversation with one another, cultural miscommunication results. Okay? So this is a big one, right? So why do men and women miscommunicate? the straightforward answer is social linguistic subcultures, right? And that's a fancy way of saying they were raised differently. They were raised to speak differently, despite being perhaps in the same family, perhaps in the same school, in the same neighborhood, in the same country. They were raised to speak differently. That's it. That's as simple as it is, right? And what does that look like, right? So when I'm sure, and this is the example I give all the time in class, if you have a sibling of the opposite sex, they are treated differently than you, right? So for example, I know for a fact that when my friends that were guys went out at night, it was no problem. Hey mom, going out. All right, have fun, be safe, whatever. But if my friends that were girls were going out, there was, this huge thing, this interrogation, like, what? You going out so late? Who are you going out with? What time are you getting back? Right? So on and so forth, right? So there's a big difference between how we're taught, even though we're in the same household, how we're taught by our family, and of course also by our schools and our societies, right? So that's the main reason why, is that boys are essentially taught to communicate like boys and men, and women are encouraged to communicate like girls and women. That's it. That's a most straightforward thing. And so again, this does not say that the previous researchers, right? This doesn't say that they're wrong, right? But the problem with this analysis is that it doesn't explain why, and the current author explains why. Okay. So now, what does this author believe? Okay, so when men and women have different experiences and operate in different social contexts, they tend to develop different genres of speech and different skills for doing things with words. Now, this is a little bit difficult to kind of give examples for, but what the author is basically saying here is that as you grow older as a girl or a boy into a woman or a man, you have different experiences, right? And those experiences give you the language you use as a man or a woman, right? So, for example, if you were a chef on Great Gordon Ramsay's Hell's Kitchen, you'd know all the chef lingo, right? Like, oh, behind, corner, um, whatever other words they use, right? So think about that, but in a more drawn out way for being a man or of a woman, right? So, here's another one. Okay, so for example, um, if you went to high school in America and you went to prom, right, which is a big, for those of you that don't know what that is, prom is a big like dance at the end of the year, at the end of high school. So the guys, the boys, they rent tuxedos, the girls they rent dresses. It's a whole thing, right? Now, if I asked a guy, do you know how to rent a dress? Do you know where to go for your makeup and to get your nails done? They would definitely say no, right? If I asked a girl or woman that's been to prom and ask them, hey, do you know how to rent a tuxedo? Guarantee you they say no, right? Guarantee you. Now, the reason for that is because the experience of renting a tuxedo is usually for men or boys, and the experience of getting your hair done, buying a dress, or renting a dress is for girls, right? And so as they grow older, they get familiar with this lingo, with this experience, and so it changes the way they speak, right? Despite being from the same family, the same school, the same whatever, neighborhood, everything. Okay. So basically, girls and boys go through different things in life, and those things teach them to communicate differently. Okay. So now, another interesting thing is that the author relates this kind of miscommunication between men and women as interethnic miscommunication, right? So it's basically saying like, hey, like the miscommunication between different ethnicities, that's literally the same thing as girls and boys miscommunicating or men and women miscommunicating. Okay. Conversation is a negotiated activity. It progresses in large part because of shared assumptions about what is going on. So this sounds very obvious, but it's not, right? When we have a conversation, you'd be surprised how much of that conversation you already know what's going to happen, right? You don't know exactly what's going to be said, but you kind of know what's going to happen. So for example, once you turn on my YouTube video, you know that I'm going to be talking to you about anthropology. Do you know exactly what I'm going to be telling you? No. But you know about, right? When you go to a store and you order something, you kind of have an understanding of what that conversation is going to be about. Okay? So that assumption, right, that our understanding of what's happening in that conversation is oftentimes thought of as, again, natural. It's thought of as something that, oh, it is what it is, right? But in reality, it's a cultural thing, right? And cultural things, as we all know, change depending on what culture you're from. So this example that he gave in the text, right? Differences in cues resulted in systemic miscommunication over whether a question was being asked, whether an argument was being made, whether a person being rude, polite, whether a speaker was relinquishing the floor, interrupting, whether and what a speaker was emphasizing, whether interactions were angry, concerned, or indifferent. They were seen as personality clashes or interpreted through the perspective of racial stereotypes, which made bad relations worse, right? So the example here is very interesting. An Indian woman was serving gravy, and she basically did not know how to communicate in a British way, right? When I say a British way, I don't just mean English. I mean like what's considered polite or impolite. Okay, so even through this microphone, you can't see me, but even through this microphone, if I asked you, gravy, right, versus gravy, right? Those are two different ways of asking gravy, and that's literally just through this microphone. Imagine if you have facial features and all these other things that you can add into it. Okay, now the Indian woman obviously did not know the British standards for communication, and just kind of she basically sounded rude, right? However, because relationships between Britain and India were really bad at the time, instead of just saying like, "Hey, this woman's not from Britain, she doesn't know how to communicate this way," it was interpreted as, "Oh, this woman, she hates British people," or Indian people, they don't have any manners, or like they shouldn't be here. Whatever it is, it morphed into something much bigger because people didn't understand that, again, this was just a cultural miscommunication. Okay, and this happens all the time, especially in New York, because there's a lot of different cultures here, right? But it's very simple, like this first sentence right here, right? Basically, a lot of people think that they're being rude when the other person might not be being rude. They're just talking the way they were taught to talk, right? So this type of miscommunication, interestingly, was basically paralleled to men and women miscommunicating. So the author believe and it is saying that interethnic miscommunication is literally the same thing as men and women miscommunicating. Okay. So how can this though be applied directly to men and women miscommunicating? So this example, there's a few of them in there, but I pulled out this one because I feel like this one everyone can understand. So minimal responses such as nods and comments like yes and mm-hmm mean different things to men and women. For women, it means something like "I'm listening, please continue," and for men, it means something similar to "I agree with you" or "I follow your argument." Those are two very different things. So basically, what they're saying is, if I were having a conversation with you, if I were like say doing that, for men it means like I'm agreeing with you, okay, I follow your argument. While for women it means I'm listening. Two different things, right? And so if you follow the example further, men think women are always agreeing, then conclude it's impossible to tell what a woman thinks, right? Because they think they're saying, oh, they agree, but in reality they're not. Women get upset with men who never seem to be listening because for men, they do not need as many minimal responses to understand that they're listening, right? So this is a very good example. I feel like everyone has gone through this, and you should try to you should see like with other people, your friends of different genders, see if this works, right? And try to do the opposite and see what happens. Okay. All right. So let's talk about subcultures. How do these subcultures form? Right. So basically, how did we get to this point? Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, we're raised differently, but more importantly, why do they happen the way they do? Right. By the time we are adults, we possess a wide variety of rules for interacting in different situations. Different sets of these rules were learned at different times and in different contexts. Not just gender, this is also about power relations. Think about making friends, romantic relationships, right? So again, as we're adults, we already know how to do a lot of things. We've been through a lot of stuff that will give us insight on how to perform our role or communicate as a man or as a woman, right? But what's really interesting is that these patterns, of course, are obtained gradually, slowly, right? According to the article, they found that from ages 5 to 15 when these skills are developed. This time is also when they are most segregated in their own sex. So what is this saying? This is basically saying that, it's funny because we develop a large part of our understanding of what it is to be a man or woman from ages 5 to 15. But what's even funnier about that is that from ages 5 to 15, that's when we hang out with our own gender the most, right? So basically, we're learning how to be women from a bunch of 5 to 15-year-old boys, and we're learning how to be men from a bunch of 15-year-old girls. So you end up creating these very exaggerated and unrealistic images of the opposite gender, okay? So members of each sex are learning self-consciously to differentiate their behavior from that of the other sex and to exaggerate these differences. Because they learn these gender-specific cultures from their age mates, children tend to develop stereotypes and extreme versions of adult behavior patterns, right? Boys and girls learn to use language in different ways because of the various different social contexts in which they learned how to carry on friendly conversation. So this is basically what I was just saying. But let's talk about, like, when you think about learning what it is to be a man or a woman or a boy or a girl, a lot of it is, hey, where's the line, right? And so if you know that women do this, you're like, okay, men have to do the opposite of that. And a lot of times it's not true, right? A lot of times it's not like the exact opposite. But because young people think in this way, it creates these very, very extreme stereotypes of the opposite gender. Okay. And so, well, where is the thing? Well, and so a large part of becoming an adult is not only learning what it is to be, a boy, a man, or a girl and a woman, but it's also learning to overcome the stereotypes that we develop from 5 to 15. All right, that's very interesting. Okay. All right. So some examples of miscommunication. Questions are viewed by women as a part of conversational maintenance, while men view them as requests for information. This is a big one. This is a big one, right? You ever hear? I mean, I see it all over TikTok and stuff. It's like where women just want to talk about something and just like express, just talk about it, and then men are just like, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? That's not the purpose of the conversation, right? When speaking, it is important for women to explicitly acknowledge the past topic, make connection, while for men, there is no such rule, sometimes intentionally ignoring preceding comments. Okay, this is interesting. This is, I believe, very much to do with, like, again, women maintaining a smooth conversation, while men is just about like finishing the topic or whatever. Okay. Verbal aggressiveness is interpreted as personal, negative, and disruptive by women, while men view it as an organizing structure for conversation. This is very interesting. Yeah, and I thought about it. It's true, right? When someone's verbally aggressive as a man, I'm just like, all right, cool. I guess that's what we're talking about, right? But for women, I believe it's thought of as like insulting and like, what is this person doing? Okay. Topics for men are narrowly defined and adhered to until finished, and shifts occur abruptly. Women develop the topic progressively and shifts gradually. These two systems interpret side comments very differently. So we just talked about this, right? So men, when they talk about things, it's this one topic, and they finish and they move on to the next one. They can change. It can change very, very quickly and very abruptly. Women, however, again, transition slowly and smoothly into other topics. Okay. Finally, problem sharing tend to produce a reassurance by women, while men respond to solutions, spouting advice, being an expert, and lecturing their audience. Number 5 and number 1 are kind of the same, right? For women, the conversation of problems is like they need reassurance. They need a bouncing board. While when men share problems, it's like for advice, which is not, not what the women want. Our conclusion: rules for interpreting conversation are culturally determined. There may be different perceptions on what is happening in a particular conversation. We have to be careful because the participants might not share cultural rule sets, right? So basically, when we are talking about men and women miscommunicating, it's because they have different rule sets for conversations. That's it. And how do they get these conversations? How do they get these rule sets? These rule sets are taught to them from a young age until they are adults of what it is to communicate like a boy or communicate like a girl, and then as a man and as a woman. Okay. Different types of interaction lead to different ways of speaking. Friendly conversation, service encounters, flirting, teaching, and polite formal interaction are all different. Even friendly conversation is different depending on how participants may define friends, right? So again, all these different communication modalities, these different like rules, these different sections of communication, they're all really dependent on what you culturally are doing, right? Like, what are you doing? Are you going on a date? Are you going for a job interview? Are you talking to your friends, right? It really depends. While most people focus on the ways in which people learn their cultural rule sets for speaking during interaction, this article suggests that it is important to always emphasize how people must overcome the previous cultural training to communicate to the opposite gender. So this last one is kind of what makes this article a little special, because honestly, the rest of it is pretty standard anthropology. But what's interesting, what this author is saying is that because we spend our time from 5 to 15 with people of the same gender, we have to overcome that stereotype of the opposite gender, right? And that's part of becoming an adult man or woman, right? Now, for this class, though, what I want you to emphasize, though, is how do men and women learn to communicate? It's through different social linguistic subcultures, right? It is essentially when we are growing up, we are taught to communicate differently because we are a boy or a girl, and eventually we go through different experiences, and then we learn what it is to be a man or woman or communicate like a man or a woman, right? It has nothing to do with anything else. It's we are taught culturally how to communicate differently. Okay. Now, oops, full circle, right? What are some differences in communication methods, right? It really depends on where you are. It depends on what situation you're in, right? Like if you're an athlete, as a woman or as a man, you communicate differently than if you were in the office. You would communicate than if you were models, right? These are all different ways of communicating. Now, let me talk about why did I choose this article. This article, and I would say these points are still pretty valid. That's why it's interesting. This article is like from the freaking 80s or 60s or something. Like it's from a very long time ago. And the reason why I picked it is because I want to show you the cultural scaffolding that we were talking about last section. Now, remember, culture never exists on its own. Now we talk a lot of students have brought up that this whole conversation about gender and modern definitions of woman and men are all crazy, but you really look at it, it's not, because yeah, you see that on Instagram, but when you look around day to day, it's not that big of a difference. And remember, culture is scaffolding, which means what? It means that previous cultural standards play into your current cultural standards, which more importantly for this is literally an article from like freaking 60 years ago, and all these things are still valid. And you're telling me that all of a sudden in 2 years things are going to change? It's impossible, right? So I just want to again I wanted to show you that when we're talking about culture changing, it takes a long time, and the changes are significant, but it takes a very long time. Okay, and that scaffolding is the most important thing. You can never, 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 never erase previous culture unless you're not part of it. You can never do that. Okay, so that's why I chose this article. The the relevancy of some of the features is crazy to me, right? Like I can't believe it's still relevant. But yeah. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. Reflection 4 and quiz is due on Friday. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kvcc.cuny.edu.